Welcome, everyone, to another edition of SCRC's Let's Talk Caregiving. I'm your host, Roberto Velasquez, President and CEO of Southern Caregiver Resource Center, and I'm here as always with my co-host, Martha Rañón, our Executive Vice President. How are you doing, Martha?
I'm doing great. Hi, Roberto.
Today's special guest is Melissa, also known as Mel McClave. Mel is a death doula and advocate for the most loving end-of-life experience possible for the dying and their loved ones. She is an expert in the last phase of life, being death, of course, by recognizing the importance of communicating end-of-life wishes to caregivers. She has helped more than 100 individuals and their families since 2018. Mel underwent death doula training, has her own business, and is part of an international and national death doula association and volunteers at different San Diego organizations. Welcome, Mel. We're so happy to have you join us here today.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my passion.
Melissa, welcome to our podcast and welcome to our conversations that we have on a monthly basis that are focused on family caregivers. And I know that in the work that we have been doing for many, many years, talking to caregivers about all of the different aspects of caregiving is important. But there's one in particular that we always want to talk about because it's very important to be aware and prepare, but that nobody wants to talk about. And that is end of life, death and dying. And in knowing and preparing that for your participation, I started thinking back to some events that we had done before where we want to include caregivers in this conversation. And we are so excited to bring the experts and talk about these essential documents and decision making. And nobody wants to be there. And we've had, a really difficult, challenging time talking to caregivers about this. So, Melissa, I am very curious to know from you, how do you just broach the subject with family caregivers about death and dying?
Well, first, let me just say thank you to all the caregivers out there. Without you, the whole end of life experience becomes really intolerable. So thank you, everybody. The way that I broach the conversation is I recognize that it has a long tail, that I just start with an opening conversation and I let the participants lead from there. I don't shy away from the conversation of dying and death. I ask open-ended questions.
So, Mel, who usually comes to you with these types of, I want to talk about end of life. I mean, often we talk about end of life, but through hospice organizations, right? And that's what people are very familiar with, or more familiar nowadays with hospice and end of life and advanced directives and making decisions. How do people get to you? I mean, are you part of hospices? Do you advertise? I mean, how do you work with individuals?
That's really interesting. When I tell people I'm in death care, the first thing they ask is, "Oh, are you hospice?" And really, I'm more than hospice. My goal is to bring loving acceptance to the end of life experience. Everybody in this room will die. There's no getting away from it. So understanding that allows me to have patience and compassion for people that are just starting to recognize their mortality and the mortality of their loved ones.
I think this is a really important, like I said, conversation. And I'm thinking about my personal situation as a caregiver when I was caring for my great aunt who had dementia. And she lived a long life, and I was very happy to have been there to care for her, especially towards the end of her life. But I remember thinking, I know Roberto and I have talked about this before, that how difficult it was to let the rest of the family know and understand, have them understand that I wasn't killing her by putting her in hospice. It wasn't my decision. It was just she was coming to the end of her life because we are all mortals. And it was just so difficult for them to understand. Um, and I think part of it is that none of us are experts in death and dying, right? I mean, we're barely experts in living, so I can see why people are hesitant to believe that, hey, this is a part of the process and this is what you're going to go through. But I was just thinking about that, and I wanted to ask you, Melissa, how do you have the families or individuals or partners really make that switch from, okay, this is it, we need to stop doing everything we can to prolong this person's life when this is no longer an option? How do you make that switch? How do you make them understand that this is where they are now in that life cycle?
I used to try to make people understand. Now, really, what I say is, I know how this ends. It always ends the same way. It always ends in death. What we have control over is how we get there. So whether or not somebody's filled out an advanced healthcare directive that's outlined their wishes when they can no longer advocate for themselves, or they haven't, they will die. And so they have left their family members or their loved ones to make those decisions for them. I just lay out the options. My biggest job is to lay out your options and to advocate for whatever you choose, whether you're the person who's dying or the loved one who's taking care of them.
I like how you're mentioning it as a process, a death care. That term is resonating with me right now because it's very true. So many times in our lives, we make choices that based on what is presented to us, right? What are you going to study when you grow up? Where are you going to work? Who are you going to, be committed to in your life? Where are you going to go to school? And we're making these choices constantly, but I feel that many times we are not as involved in our end of life choices, right? We just kind of leave it up to whatever happens, happens. And many times we lose that ability to be engaged in that process. What do you think, Roberto?
Well, I'll say that I agree completely with what you're saying. We celebrate our culture. We celebrate life. We celebrate landmark events like birthdays and marriages and births, and we put a lot of emphasis on that. And yet, one of the um, things that will, as Mel has said, will happen to all of us, and we all know this, is at some point we're all going to pass away. We're all going to die, but we don't like to talk about that. And and I remember also from my family, like when my father passed away, and him being Mexican American and very cultural rooted ideals and religion, and in his mind it was almost like bad luck to talk about death. He didn't have a will. He didn't have an advance directive. He just said, you all just do whatever you think is right. And it put a lot of pressure on us, really, and including my mom. Like, we had to have multiple sit down meetings with mom to talk about end of life for dad. And finally, we all came to agreement on, because we had to sort of really analyze what my dad's life was like and then come to some conclusion, because he was not conscious anymore. And then we were at peace with it. But there was no communication from him. And I know one of the things that's really important for us as caregivers, as just individuals who are connected to somebody who maybe be at the end of life type of phase of their life, is for us to be good listeners. to listen to what their needs are, because it's really not about us. It's about the individual who's dying. And again, our family caregivers are dealing with or supporting loved ones with chronic disabling conditions, and they all will end up at some time in death. And we need to be conscious of that, accepting of that, and even listening to what their wishes are, and try to make some sense out of it and put a plan in place, I think. Marta?
I remember hearing a physician who was talking about end of life, and he put it in very interesting terms. He said, I've told my family how I want my last ceremonies to be, right? What kind of music to play, what kind of people, who to invite, what kind of flowers to have. He says, but I keep changing the songs that I want. So I keep updating my playlist. And I started laughing, and a lot of us started laughing because, something so mundane as your playlist. But for him, it was important to let people know that that's part of what he wanted as his, last ceremony and last remembrance of him. And so I thought, what a great idea. If you're going to plan out this going away party, why not be involved with all the details of what that should look like? And of course, I'm talking about the party, but I'm really also trying to say about, end of life and all of your wishes as it pertains to your health, and doctor and resuscitation and medicine and life sustaining measures. So I think it is really important. And I actually have taken that to my personal life. And I've talked to my brother who's younger than I am, and he has a healthcare directive, and he has shared his wishes with me. And I know we're probably, and I don't know, you might be able to tell me this better, Melissa. I don't know if we are the anomaly because we're much younger than when people come to having to make these decisions. Usually it's, you're in that situation when you're trying to decide, like Roberto was talking about his dad. But I think being prepared is what has helped me deal with that eventuality. Be more aware of what's to come, because I know what I want, and I know, for example, what my brother wants. And even with my aunt as her caregiver, I knew what her wishes were, so it made it a little bit more manageable in that situation, that it wasn't an unknown. It wasn't out of control. Yes, she was dying, and yes, we tried to give her as much comfort, but we also knew what her wishes were. So there was no question about it. And I think that's what we are lacking in our awareness, that we need to be able to take that into consideration. I don't know what you think about that, Melissa.
Well, I think it's irony is that it is the younger generations that are willing to look at their mortality with more clarity and less fear, and will do things like fill out an advanced care directive, and will do things like write their own obituaries, and will do all of the exercises. There's a lot of exercises we can do to remind us of our mortality. I think a big part of that is the change in dying and in the after death options. So in California, we have medical aid in dying. It's been legal in California since 2017 if you qualify. And that means that you don't have to subject yourself to all of the treatments that are recommended, because really physicians are there to treat rather than to help you die. So you don't have to do that. You have that option if you want it. We also have body disposition options, right? So you can do a whole body donation. You can do aqua cremation, which is a very gentle water-based way of taking the flesh off the bones, really is what it comes down to. You don't have to be cremated in a fire cremation, in a retort. You don't have to be embalmed, and you can have natural burial. So there's all these options that people haven't considered after what to do with my body. It used to be when you died, you were either cremated or you were buried.
Wasn't it Luke Perry who was buried in a mushroom suit in California? And when I heard that, I thought, what a neat idea. You're kind of recycling, decomposing, but you're composting and helping the environment.
So human composting will be legal in California in 2025. There's nobody that's doing that here, but Washington State is usually at the forefront of body disposition, and it's legal in Washington State.
Mm-hmm.
Mel, I did want to ask you, in your experience in working with so many families about this topic of death and dying, is, what are some of the biggest fears that individuals have about death and dying, and how do you help them in whatever way you can help them in overcoming some of these fears? Because I mean, we think of death as painful, sad. There's a lot of anguish. We're going to miss somebody. Hospitals where it's cold and, you know, everybody there is sick. I mean, that's how we think of it, right? I mean, I would imagine most people do. What are some of the fears that you see when you're working with families about this topic? I mean, it's such an important topic.
So the name of my business is Last Acts of Love, and you can reach me at lastactsoflove.com. And really what it comes down to are three main focuses. One is, was I loved? People want to know that they were loved. They want to hear stories about how other people loved them. The other thing people want to know is, did other people feel my love? People want to know that other people felt their love. They want to hear stories about how their love was felt by family and friends, and really the community at large, which leads to the last thing. People want to know that their life made a positive difference in the world. And when I'm working with families, that is my focus. My focus is to focus on how this person who's dying or has already died has been full of love and been loved and has made a positive difference, and they've been witnessed. That is how I do my work. And I just want to say that one of the ways that I do a lot of outreach. And if you go to my website, lastactsoflove.com, or email me at melissa@lastactsoflove.com, I'll put you on a subscriber list. I do 3 death cafes a month. 2 are online and 1 is in person. I host workshops on dying. I have one in June, on June 20th, in person. I do tons of outreach. I work with a hospice. I work with a mortuary. I work with all sorts of different people to just bring the conversation into everyday conversation.
Yeah, I think that's really important, the conversation being in everyday conversation. I mean, that's the only way, I guess, to normalize the whole spectrum of life, right? And still, it's very difficult for people to do so. It's just a big challenge, and then it becomes a very complicated matter at the end if these conversations have not transpired, and it's even harder if it's just all at the end instead of a conversation throughout time. But I appreciate very much the type of work that you do.
One of the last things I wanted to ask Melissa was, you mentioned that the younger generation seems a little bit more open to talking about death and dying. And I think that's where we find the difficulty in the family caregiver. The family caregivers are the younger generation taking care of their parents, for example, who don't want to have these conversations. And so you have two different generations with two different viewpoints as it pertains to death and dying. So, what do you recommend for these caregivers that they handle these situations?
One of the things that I usually will ask if we're already talking about like funeral planning, if you go to a funeral of your friend or family and you talk about food, like what kind of food do you want served at your funeral? And if they go, I don't care, and they're like, okay, well, let's do sushi. And they'll be like, oh, no, not sushi. So it isn't necessarily what they want, it's what they don't want. And that's a really great way to open up the conversation. But the most important thing is to tell your loved ones your memories of when you felt their love, when you felt love for them, and when you witnessed them making the world a better place. Because really that's what it comes down to, whether they go gently into that good night or they, fight it tooth and nail, it ends the same way. So what we can do is bring loving connection into the experience to the best of our abilities.
What a wonderful message. Thank you so much for sharing that. Well, that's all the time we have left for this edition of Let's Talk Caregiving. To hear more of our podcasts, follow us on your favorite podcasting platforms or visit our website at scrc.care. I want to thank Martha for co-hosting another important discussion, our guest, Melissa Mel McClave, and our audience for tuning in. If you're providing support to a loved one, you don't have to do this alone. Asking for help is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. To connect to our programs and services, visit our website at scrc.care or call us at 1-800-827-1008. If you live outside of San Diego and Imperial counties, visit caregivercalifornia.org to find the closest caregiver resource center near you. To support our efforts and make a tax-deductible donation, please go to scrc.care and click on the Donate tab. And remember, SCRC is here for you, caring for those who care for others.